again. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jean Howard from the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and I'm pleased to be introducing this panel on my colleague Nicole Wallack's important new book, Crafting Presence, The American Essay and the Future of Writing Studies. Nicole has been a valued member of our department for over a decade and has shown incredible leadership in transforming our writing program into an innovative site for teaching and learning, and for promoting the status of lecturers across the university. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel today, and I'm going to start by introducing the panelists. Nicole herself received her PhD from NYU in 2004 and is now the director of Columbia's undergraduate writing program. She teaches seminars on writing pedagogy, American literature and film, creative nonfiction, literatures of fact, public intellectuals, and undergraduate essay writing courses. She's also senior associate at the Institute for Writing and Thinking at Bard College, where she conducts intensive seminars on writing-based teaching for educators across the disciplines. An active scholar, her articles, essays, and reviews have appeared in many venues, including public books, and her book, Crafting Presence, which we will be discussing today, was published in 2017 and argues that an essay-based pedagogy in high school and college can enact the goals of a liberal education more effectively and ethically than can college and career readiness paradigms. Nicole is also active in the wider profession, holding positions in the Council of Writing Program Administrators, the MLA Committee on Contingent Labor in the Profession, and bless her soul, in Columbia's Senate. In a moment, she'll be introducing her work to us, and her presentation will be followed by brief remarks from our three panelists, whom I will now introduce in order. After they've spoken, we'll have questions and a more general discussion. Our first discussant today is Sharon Marcus, Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and Editor-in-Chief of Public Books. Her most recent book, The Drama of Celebrity, will be published by Princeton this coming June. After her administrative stint as Columbia's first Associate Dean for the Humanities, we are all very glad to have Sharon fully back in our faculty. Our second speaker will be Leslie Jameson, who's the author of New York Times bestsellers The Recovering and The Empathy Exams, as well as a novel, The Gin Closet. She is currently a writer for the New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, and the Virginia Quarterly Review, where she is editor-at-large. She was the guest editor for the 2017 edition of Best American Essays and currently directs the graduate nonfiction program here at Columbia. Our final speaker is Howard Tinberg, a professor of English at Bristol Community College in Massachusetts and former editor of the journal Teaching English in the two-year college. Professor Tinberg is the author of Border Talk, Writing and Knowing in the Two-Year College, and Writing with Consequence, What Writing Does in the Disciplines. He's also co-author of the Community College Writer, Exceeding Expectations, and of Teaching, Learning, and Holocaust, an Integrative Approach. He has written prize-winning articles, been named as U.S. Community College's Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation and the American Council on Education, served as chair of the Conference on College Composition and Communication, and been named as Museum Teaching Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're pleased to have such a distinguished and lively group of panelists with us today, but let's start with Nicole talking about her book.
Wow. So, thank you. I am terrible about thank yous because I tend to go on for a long time. So I could spend my entire 10 minutes here saying thank you, but I must say some, and then I'll say others later. So first, of course, I want to thank Jean and Sharon and Leslie and Howard for accepting the invitation to talk about the book and read it. Wonderful. Thank you. That is wonderful. I want to thank Eileen Galuli and Emily Bloom from the Society of Fellows and the Harriman Center for hosting this event, and to Sarah Cole, Divisional Dean of Humanities, who proposed that we have this talk for my book, which I have to say as a non-tenured faculty member is not that typical. So I really appreciated that visibility. And to Alan Stewart, our current chair of English, who also utterly supported me and supported this project here. And of course to you all for being here. I see so many different parts of writing, teaching, history, students, everyone, and it just, my family is here. It means a great deal to me. So I just want to give you a little frame for why it took so long to get this book written. Well, it turns out that if you're a person, as I was, who went to university in Canada back in the dark times of 1984, it wasn't as dark then as we might think it is now, who went through a literature program there as a 19th century Brit Lit person, that you wouldn't think you'd end up writing about the essay and turning into a writing program administrator and being interested in these ideas. But what happened there was I began to get confused, even in my first years of university, about why it was that one could study literature and not study writing, per se. And why these discussions just didn't seem to happen with any regularity. And then when I came back to go to graduate school at NYU, I went with the promise or hope that my program in English education, the doctoral program there, would give a space where it would intersect literature, writing, creative writing. And in fact, what I found was wonderful scholars there, including Gordon Pradle and Barbara Danish and others, but who had at some level carved out the niche for themselves in composition and rhetoric studies or English education studies. And therefore I could feel the tensions that were in the field at the time around a kind of siloing of what we knew from one another. And at the same time, I was teaching writing for my fellowship. Sound familiar, anybody? And I realized how hard it was, and how satisfying it was, and how odd it was that I didn't really know what essays were, and why I hadn't really been taught to read them or write them in the ways that I was reading and writing them, basically with my students in the room. So, a few years into that, because one of the directors there was Alfie Guy, who is here today, I learned of the work of the Institute for Writing and Thinking at Bard College and became involved with that work to do work in middle schools, high schools, access-oriented institutions across the country and internationally for teaching writing. And what I realized there was that we, in the college settings, had very little idea of how writing was being taught in those settings. And it felt like missed opportunity after missed opportunity. And so, in part, I wrote the book to see what I could do about making us visible to one another, making us present to one another, as creative writers, as literary scholars and cultural scholars, and as compositionists for what is now, what I hope to be, a wider and more capacious sense of writing studies. So this book found its way into the world in part because there was already this resource called the Best American Essays, which you can get at any airport convenience store, and you can get it at any big box, anything you want, and it was full of essays. And that it was a place where essays would coalesce. And each year, it wasn't only one person's idea of what an essay was, but it was practitioners in the field who would choose a series of essays and say something about them. And I thought, this is what we need. We need to get some of these ideas out in the world. And so I came to the notion that the crux of the essay, the thing that we knew least about, was what is most important about it, namely, how a writer becomes present on the page. Not because I think that we all have to be more hyper-visible than in fact we are now. Parts of this piece were begun while the internet was in its infancy, okay? So we have plenty of exposure to one another. What we do not have is means or genres that we use to test how we are in the world and to develop who we are in the world over time. And so the case that I make for the essay is that it is the intellectual practice that we can start teaching. We do teach from middle school onwards, but our students, and at some level teachers ourselves, we don't learn enough from what we're doing with it over time. And so this book is trying to make that intervention. And I'm going to stop here and look forward to hearing responses. Thank you.
I'm Sharon Marcus, you can see that. And a lot of what Nicole writes about in Crafting Presence is the ways that essays are places where readers encounter writers. And I think in honor of that, I'm going to begin by just situating myself in relationship to Nicole and her book. So I came to this book about essay reading, writing, and teaching of essays. First of all, as the editor of Public Books, where I have edited probably 600 essays over the last 6 years. And our motto is actually think in public, and one of the points that Nicole makes about the essay, one of her definitions of the essay, is that it is public thinking. So that was something that resonated with me. I'm a teacher of Victorian literature, where we have students write essays, but we also read famous essays by people like John Stuart Mill, Walter Pater, and Matthew Arnold, all of which were originally published in periodicals that now get taught as though they existed outside that kind of literary marketplace. I'm a scholar of performance, where presence is an extremely vexed and vexing term, but an important one. And I am also Nicole's neighbor in Philosophy Hall. Her office is opposite mine. We're both on the ground floor, which is the 3rd floor. And the Writing Center and University Writing Program that she directs is in between us. And so I'm very aware of the energy that buzzes around the Writing Center because of Nicole and her colleagues there. So it's with each of these elements of who I am that I respond to Nicole's book. And I have to say, I recognized in her very first paragraph both the signs of good writing and the world that Nicole has created at Columbia, even though the first paragraph is about NYU. So this is the preface. At the very center of our office at New York University, at any given time of day and into the night, lots of nights, a half dozen or more graduate students congregated and chatted around 3 white formica tables, at least 5 feet long apiece, set end to end, as if someone were preparing the room for a celebratory dinner with far-flung relations. And in a disciplinary sense, we were. There's a lot to say about what makes that such a great paragraph, and one that certainly establishes Nicole's presence from the outset, but I'm going to restrict myself to one, which is the 3 white formica tables. Concrete particulars grounded in observation, but also a metaphor of a community that is an archipelago. There are 3 tables. They don't exactly connect. And when I go into the Writing Center, as I sometimes do in search of a photocopier that works, or maybe some stray candy, I'm always struck by the energy in the room. There's a particular blend of anxiety and absorption. There are people sitting at lots of different tables that both create privacy, but a lot of exposure. You can hear what is going on as students bring papers to be read by teachers who are giving student writing their full attention. I think of it as an emergency room for the students' essays, papers, and thesis chapters. And like all emergency rooms, it's throbbing with the energy of injury and repair. In this book, Nicole offers many definitions of an essay, and I thought I would probably be the one speaking first, so I thought I would take it upon myself to just lay out for you what Nicole lays out about what essays are. And some of these definitions that I'm going to present are ones she's citing, some of them she's arguing with, and many are her own. As Jean already indicated, Nicole suggests that the essay is the liberal arts genre. Citing Cynthia Ozick, she says good essays should be persuasive but not preachy. It's a form that unsettles both author and readers. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's also a form at the intersection of creative writing, the teaching of literature, and composition. And most importantly, I think Nicole's chief interventions are to offer an audience-based definition of the essay, that an essay is written for a public of multiple audiences, and that's an interesting and telling definition of public, that it already has heterogeneity, conflict, and a need to bridge differences built into it. And Nicole also provides what I thought of as an action-based definition of the essay, that suggests an essay is what it does, rather than a more conventional way of defining a genre in terms of taxonomies or certain features you would check off a list. And what an essay does, according to Nicole, is force, stage, provoke, host an interaction between a reader's beliefs and a writer's beliefs. And so when we come to an essay, we have beliefs that we will find confirmed and challenged, but the author in writing the essay is imagining a reader, and in the process of imagining that reader is also both testing and presenting a set of beliefs. And the way that the essay creates this confrontation between readers and writers is that the essay itself consists of an interaction. And here what Nicole says is essays are interactions between concepts and presence. So presence is what she spends the book defining. You can think of it as voice, you can think of it as individuality, as someone's character or personality or ethos. There are other terms that come up like form, which is both a useful term and sometimes it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I like that Nicole offered other meanings of what presence might be besides form. And in addition to being things like ethos and individuality, there are emotional and ethical elements associated with the essay, like confidence and compassion, or some that Nicole mentions. So those all make up presence. And on the other side, presence is interacting with the two of the other three key components of the essay, which are evidence and ideas. So as I understood it, concepts are evidence plus ideas, and these confront presence, but they are all working through each other. And Nicole's very clear about this. A good essay isn't all style and no substance, and nor is it really solid substance without style. So genres like scholarly articles will have evidence and ideas. They do not have to have presence. So I also understood Nicole to be arguing that presence is it's not the only ingredient in an essay, but it is the ingredient that makes an essay an essay. And what Nicole does throughout this book is read great essays by Susan Sontag, by Gerald Early, by Jamaica Kincaid, very close, slow readings that give you a sense of how you would teach the essay, what you would discuss with students in a class that revolved around that essay. And she reads those essays for presence, to understand how the authors create presence, to help us understand how, as teachers of writing or writers ourselves, we might do the same. I could say a lot more, and I'll save it for discussion, about what it means to make presence a key term, but anybody who has even a distant sense of the interventions of deconstruction and a work like of grammatology in the 80s, which even people who haven't read those books have absorbed some of these ideas, they were a real attack on a certain kind of presence or a notion of presence. And so one of the things I'd be curious to talk about is how much pushback you've gotten from using that term presence, even in performance studies, to say something like live performers have presence can get you into really long debates about whether there is such a thing and what its relationship is to representation. So the last point I want to make is, as someone who teaches and publishes essays and has a strong sense of the work that goes into making them, it was clear to me that this book has several protagonists. the essay is one of its heroes, of course, so is presence. And so are readers, writers, and teachers, and people who combine all of those. It's not a book with equally strong antagonists, and I think that says a lot about Nicole as a leader and a thinker who's more interested in bringing people into conversation than battles that lead to victors and losers. But I did detect a minor villain. And with that, and it seemed to me that there was a minor villain in this book named Skills. So skills don't get a lot, but at one point Nicole writes, students need to learn not just skills but also writing practices, so that cued me that somehow skills aren't so great. And then elsewhere, although it is possible and sometimes necessary to teach skills discreetly, and I was like, ooh, skills, like why are they bad? So I get a sense that there's some kind of insider baseball polemic going on that has to do with the scholarship around teaching writing. That the book is actually a delight to read, and you don't need any specialist knowledge to understand any of it. It's all beautifully clear. But I would like to hear more about this debate about skills, because from where I sit, I don't see any difference between teaching skills, teaching practices, and teaching the kind of connected, engaged reading, writing enmeshment that you're proposing. And I also think that it can be easier sometimes for students to just practice a discrete skill rather than try to put all this stuff together and write an essay as good as Jamaica Kincaid's or something as good as your book in their first elementary writing classes. But the final thing that I want to say is that reading this book was really like being Nicole's neighbor. And to read this book is to experience what she opens up with discussing. It is like joining her at those white formica tables where people are just having passionate discussions about what it means to read and write and to teach writing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi all, I'm Leslie. I'm going to time myself so I don't go over. First of all, I just want to quickly say thank you so much, Nicole, for inviting me to be part of this. I come to it from another side of campus, literally and spiritually, but I'm so glad to be here. Listen, this is the brief biography of an essay. It was born as an article. Actually, it was born as a commission. An editor at a glossy New York magazine, specifically the one called New York Magazine, asked me if I wanted to write a reported article about kids with past life memories and the psychologist down in Virginia who was compiling a database of their stories. I said yes, with an exclamation point. I said yes because I've always been curious about beliefs that other people dismiss out of hand, and because I'm fascinated by how we tell ourselves stories, not just in order to live, but in order to make sense of our lives. This seemed like a natural extension of that interest. How we tell stories to make sense of our prior lives as well. Before I even wrote the article, I knew what I wanted to call it. We tell ourselves stories in order to live again, in honor of Our Lady Didion, and maybe also in order to prove something to that one reviewer, well, maybe more than one, who said I had no sense of humor. I said yes because I'd written many personal essays and many critical essays, and even a fair number of essays that straddled that categorical divide or tried to render it porous. But I was still eager to prove myself as a writer of reported essays, which seemed more ambitious and less solipsistic. Plus, it was exciting that anyone wanted to pay to find me anywhere. So I flew to Charlottesville, where I interviewed the psychologist and took notes about his offices full of ESP testing chambers and bent spoon experiments, and accompanied him on interviews with families whose children remembered being tobacco farmers and artists, and sat in a hotel lobby when my flight was delayed, newly single and somewhat newly sober, drinking seltzer and feeling lonely. Then I flew to Louisiana and interviewed a family whose son believed he'd been a Navy pilot in World War II, and I wasn't necessarily convinced his soul had once belonged to a pilot, or that I could even tell you definitely what a soul was, but I did find it fascinating that believing in this transference of souls had become so important to his whole family, who had subsequently devoted themselves to finding out everything they could about the naval aircraft carrier he remembered flying from. What can I say? The magazine cut the article because they thought the main question was, is reincarnation real? And I thought the main question was, how has reincarnation helped these families understand their lives? The article found a new home with a different magazine that had a more essayistic reputation, but I don't honestly think the article became an essay until 3 years later when I rewrote it as a very different piece. A piece that was still about reincarnation and still about these families, but also trying to figure out why I'd gotten so obsessed with them and so defensive about their beliefs. Certain root structures of fascination started rising to the surface. How I'd come to believe in the unoriginality of every person, that this was not hopeless but saving, and how I loved the strangely literal way reincarnation acknowledged the fundamental unoriginality of what we called ourselves. How I wanted to believe in the possibility of continuity and transformation at once, how these beliefs and desires had everything to do with my life in recovery and my life in serial monogamy. That's when my maudlin, seltzer-drinking self slipped into the frame of the piece. When the article became an essay, I guess you could say it was reborn. Now, listen harder. What was the point of telling that opening story? Did I tell that story to illustrate the difference between an article and an essay, that the piece's first incarnation understood itself primarily as a vessel for reportage, and its next iteration understood that reportage as a set of materials engaged in the service of exploring more fundamental questions about how we understand identity or selfhood? That story in order to think about presence, that fruitful and fascinating conceptual lens through which we are thinking about the genre of the essay today, thanks to Nicole's illuminating book. Presence is certainly a useful way to consider the evolution of that piece, not only because I became more present by bringing my personal life into the frame, my sobriety, my recovery, my breakups, and my days watching TV at the hotel lobby bar, but because my reflections were allowed greater room to unfurl, because I let myself take up space, not just as a body or a biography, but as a questioning mind. Or did I tell that story so that I could break it off partway through in order to ask why I was telling it, in order to enact precisely the kind of structural fissure that summons presence most palpably, the kind of presence that correlates, as Peter Elbow puts it, quote, with places where the text has a hole or crack or disjuncture. That idea resonates with me deeply as a writer and a reader, this notion that we feel presence most deeply, as Nicole points out, not just in moments of a voice or sensibility shoring up coherence, but in those cracks or rifts in the text, when the smooth, laminated surface breaks open to expose the messier complexities beneath. It's akin to what Janet Malcolm points out about a certain kind of biography that complicates its own authority. This is a quote from her book, The Silent Woman. Every now and then, a biography comes along that strangely displeases the public. Something causes the reader to back away from the writer and refuse to accompany him down the corridor. What the reader has usually heard in the text, what has alerted him to danger, is the sound of doubt, the sound of a crack opening in the wall of the biographer's self-assurance. As a burglar should not pause to discuss with his accomplice the rights and wrongs of burglary while he is journeying a lock, so a biographer ought not to introduce doubts about the legitimacy of the biographical enterprise. But I'm interested, and of course Malcolm is as well, and Elbow and Nicole, by the ways that discussing the burglary while it's still going on can actually humanize a piece, can illuminate the human sensibility creating it, as well as complicate its portrait of its subjects. This willingness to discuss that burglary as it's happening is part of the terrain of the essay. That willingness to open up a fissure in the text and then descend into it, find out what's happening there. That's part of the electricity of an essay, that sense that the floor of the piece has dropped out to reveal a deeper floor beneath it. Nicole writes, when we encounter a piece in which we discern the writer's presence, we may call its virtues by other names. Individuality, investment, invention, and so we wait for the writer. Often, the writer shows up late. And here I am, showing up in this talk, not just as the person who once wrote an article about reincarnation that got killed by its magazine and reborn as an essay, but as a teacher of essays and a curator of essays. When I look back at my own process of selecting essays for Best American in 2017 through the lens of presence, it rings true as a common thread connecting the essays I selected. For example, Elise Goldbach's essay, White Horse, not only manifested presence by telling the story of its author's experience of sexual assault, it also included footnotes that allowed her to question her own narration as she offered it, and this more complicated, layered version of presence was more illuminating to me than simply narrating personal experience would have been. Jason Arment's essay, Two Graves, narrates his interrogation of an Iraqi bomb maker at camp during his time serving in the Second Gulf War, where he tells us that his unit used two shallow graves, half dug by the ruined walls of a brick house to intimidate the people they interrogated. The ending of the essay blew me away because it was all about presence. Arment writes, "When Echo first arrived in the desert plain, I'd thought the graves could be used for whoever we caught out here. Now I knew better. One grave for the bomb maker, and one grave for whatever was left of me at the end of all this." Arment, that line still gives me chills. Arment reveals that the grave he's been regarding throughout the entire essay holds him, or the self he once was. He implicates himself as part of the damage. As I read Nicole's wonderful book about presence, I kept thinking of how I might frame some of the most fruitful kinds of essayistic presence as subterranean presence. So much of the presence that feels most compelling to me isn't just exposure or reflection or artistic imprint. It somehow creates or manifests a sense of uncovering. It's not just presence, but emergence, whether that emergence is sudden or gradual, the body revealed in the grave, the self transitioning from obscurity or opacity to visibility or expression. It's not just presence through formal or conceptual sensibility or through personal narrative, but presence as self-interrogation. A few weeks ago, I was on a panel at the Texas Book Festival with an essayist named Kiese Lamon, who was answering a question about when he first became a writer. He didn't point to the first time he wrote something he was proud of, or even the first time he wanted to be a writer. Instead, he described the first time that he used writing to discover, as he put it, the ways he was lying to himself. He told the story of deciding to boycott his high school graduation because the then governor of Mississippi, Kirk Fortescue, was going to be his speaker. He told everyone he was boycotting to protest Fortescue, but when his mother asked him to write about his decision, she desperately wanted him to be a writer, he realized through the act of writing that he wasn't just boycotting as noble protest. He was boycotting because he was ashamed of his own academic performance, that he was graduating in the bottom fifth of his class, and he'd expected so much more from himself. That's a powerful kind of presence, not just showing up in a piece of writing, but digging underneath the visible self or the most apparent self to find the messier self beneath. If we are thinking about the writer showing up late, then there's something important not just about the showing up, but about the lateness, about the fact that it can't or doesn't happen right away or all at once, that it is somehow a process across the piece rather than a given embedded in its premise. That's where the essay finds its force for me, not just in presence, but in partial or emerging presence, in the staging of that excavation, in the obscure self made visible.
What a marvelous panel. Thank you, Nicole, for inviting me to be part of it. My name is Howard Tinberg, and I teach at Open Access Institution, otherwise known as a community college. And I think the perspective I bring to the book is quite distinctive, and I'll try to sort of see the essay through that lens of the institutional framework. In my brief remarks, I want to sort of tease a few threads. One, I think I'd like to sort of discuss the marginalization of the essay as a genre. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the distinction between presence and the personal. And then finally, I'd like to talk about reading, which is a subject that folks of us in higher ed don't necessarily talk a lot about. which is how do we get students to read? And I mean read in a deep sense. What might essays, thank you, what might essays teach us about reading itself and the teaching of reading? Okay, I'll begin with an admission, and this probably doesn't come as a surprise to you, Nicole, but I was not predisposed to accepting your key premise. The future of writing studies rests with the essay. Oh, I think I have a sense of deja vu. By the way, my dissertation was in British Romanticism before I entered Comp Red, and there's a long story there. But having taught at a public open access institution for over 3 decades, I've long since concluded that to reach my very diverse and often underprepared students in our college's required first-year composition course, I needed to think broadly, beyond the essay genre, which for many of my students was synonymous with failure and with privilege. And given my students' very pragmatic set of expectations, I want to get a job, a good paying job to support their families. I sensed that their concern was that I needed to give them something else. Maybe the skills that Sharon was talking about before. By the way, we can have a long discussion about how Comp Red looks at the coded term, the skills at any point. Maybe we'll have a discussion. For a time, I even reduced the amount of reading beyond student work itself. In other words, essentially, there was no text. There was just a student writing. At the very start of my teaching career, as a graduate teaching assistant at an R1 institution, I required that students read professionally produced essays. E.B. White's "Once More to the Lake" comes to mind. To be fair to the writers of those essays and to Nicole's guiding principles, I had little understanding of the essay as a genre, indeed of the concept of genre itself as it applied beyond literature. That was way back in the late 70s, and I was a grad student in a very traditional lit-centric English department. There was little talk of discourse communities, although Stanley Fish was causing trouble up in Berkeley. He began to cause some ripples in his work on Milton. And while I read Montaigne in a grad Renaissance survey course, the last thing I would have thought would be to associate Montaigne with the work of my first-year comp writers. The rest, as I say, is history. The process movement took hold. Faculty were beginning to consider student writing as serious work worthy of study in their own right. And I should say, careful thought, even as Maya Shaughnessy demonstrated the work on the value of basic writing and basic writers. The field of composition was beginning to define itself. Nicole provides an efficient account of those heady early days, as well as an expeditious survey of where our discipline is right now. I will say this as to the current state of affairs when it comes to the teaching of writing at the college level. While our field continues to promote compositions that span modalities, genres, and digital affordances, and while it has quite eloquently articulated outcomes for first-year composition that impressively encompass such difficult concepts as rhetorical awareness, writing transfer, and metacognition, a national survey of writing instruction, as Nicole notes, points overwhelmingly to the use of writing as transactional, that is, as knowledge, that is, as recapitulation of a subject, as a vessel in which to regurgitate information. And then this book comes along. I'm intrigued by what seems to be the kind of retro move here. Retro in at least a couple of senses. Taking us back to the essay as a significant and teachable genre in a first-year comp class, and to do so by invoking what at first glance seems to be right out of the expressivist playbook, presence. I think Peter Up was just invoked, as a matter of fact, and of course Peter Upple's early work was focusing on the presence of the writer to the exclusion of the teacher, in fact, in the classroom. But the essay, as it's described here, is not the school-based, thesis-driven 5-paragraph affair, and presence is not to be confused with autobiography or the personal, as that term is normally used in first-year comp. The genre of the essay is here taken to be an exploratory and somewhat discursive form, inquiry-driven. I applaud Nicole for liberating the essay, if that's the term, from its school debasement. But what I found truly noteworthy and interesting is the complexity summed up in these two statements. Essays are not personal, and the writer is always present.
What constitutes a writer's presence, if not the personal? It's a deep commitment and motive to explore an idea, not as an academic exercise, but rather as an authentic curiosity and emotional investment. And it's a fierce and courageous engagement with the past, what Nicole calls historical thinking, or the act of making history itself, which I take to mean not just a collection of facts, but a careful selection of facts and an insertion of oneself into history. The result is a hybrid of critical and creative thought, a blend of memory and interpretation. Complicating turns of thought are typical, as is a rich consideration of implications, the very qualities that we hope to encourage in our students' writing. Now about reading. I want to give a special shout out to the attention paid here to reading. The sad truth is that English departments in trilogy and criticism have ceded the teaching of reading long ago to the schools and community colleges, where, and here's a newsflash I suppose for many, developmental reading and departments have begun to be dismantled. Indeed, at community colleges, teaching of reading has been subsumed by English, and that developmental courses are, in fact, disappearing and becoming co-requisite courses. I can talk more about that later. The important work of Louise Rosenblatt on interpretive reading sadly has not received the attention that it deserves, nor has Anne Bertoff's appeal that we pay attention to practical and interpretive criticism. And while composition studies has shown an interest in reading instruction over the years, that interest has fluctuated considerably, perhaps playing a secondary role to the consolidation of the discipline of composition and rhetoric. Hence my surprise that Nicole places reading as a critical element of the essays. I was especially taken by the fact that so many of the essays featured in the book foreground the act of reading. For example, Virginia Woolf appeals to a common reader, but more significantly, she challenges the reader to engage in a radical empathy. Do not dictate to your author, she writes, try to become him. This notion flips the usual script that I always share with my students, which calls for the author to work hard at reaching out to her audience. The many writers represented in this book challenge readers in important ways, and we need not shy away from such a challenge, but work to encourage our students to engage complex ideas and emotionally charged images. Among all of the essays featured in this book, I found Franklin Burroughs' Compression of Will the most compelling for many reasons, not least of which is Burroughs' effort to place the reading of Hopkins' poem, High Beauty, in the author's attempt to understand where he has come from and where he is headed. By the way, those questions, where have you come from and where are you going, are uppermost in the minds of many of my own students, who grapple with difficult pasts, sometimes traumatic pasts, even as they aspire toward a fulfilling career. I believe that my students might see their own origins and aspirations in these words, and I'm quoting from Burroughs. Where you are from is never simply a matter of geography. It involves intersections of history, economics, family, and so forth, as well as the coordinates between latitude and longitude. Self-location, with or without maps, is ultimately as complicated and incomplete a process as self-knowledge. Something in us won't keep still. It's marvelous. The fact is, however, that as much as essays such as Woolf and Burroughs challenge readers to confront and to not fear complexity, many students, certainly a good number of my students, lack the confidence to take that complexity on. In Nicole's terms, they are either reporters or proclaimers. That is, they become nearly invisible in their response to what they read, or they simply insert themselves without engaging an author's ideas in a genuine way. They lack the confidence to interpret, let alone authentically challenge what they read. Perhaps key to promoting that confidence to students as readers and writers is to give them the freedom to inquire, to interpret, and to construct their own meaning. What Nicole and Gordon Prater call primary acts of reading, to establish their own sets of understanding and perhaps ambivalence, as well as uncertainty, rather than expect them to conform to a single faculty-authorized reading or critique of a work of literature or nonfiction, I say. We might begin to model that tolerance with uncertainty and ambiguity ourselves. Thank you very much.
questions that she would like to, or we can open it to the audience. Nicole?
I'd just like to say first, thank you so much for those responses. They are their own book of really key issues that, in fact, this is the book I'd like to see written. I would like to see an anthology of work by literary scholars, compositionists, creative writers in collaboration to talk about the things that we do in and across the work. I want to think about just briefly the minor villain. Because I was trying to be less subtle than that. I mean, not usually my problem. Here's the thing. My concern is that we are teaching every day and using a tremendous amount of our labor, as everyone in this room knows, to teach essay writing. And when we teach it through the lens of skill, at the middle school and the high school and the college level, I think that students, as you were saying, Howard, about your own students, are thinking a little bit too much of where they're going and a little too little about where they are. And that means that school isn't real. Because skills we think of as those terrible reps you do because someday you're going to need that muscle for something, instead of something that, in fact, I am using right now. And that I never exercise a skill, I exercise a belief, I exercise a wish, I exercise a bias, and I make that material in the world. And so I want people to have skills, but the order of operations for me is incorrect. Right? If I lead with the skills, guess what they're going to learn how to ask for when they go out beyond our classes? The skills. Give me the handout. Give me the thing that will already let me know what the object is. And to be honest, we don't know what the object is. And they won't when they go out into their working lives or their school lives and their family lives, community lives. And if there's a thing that I feel like we need to help people do, again, middle school onwards, this shouldn't be news to people coming to university, coming to college, that the hardest thing to do is to ask what you yourself are thinking. So, Leslie, I so appreciated where you were talking about what is subterranean, in that folks are not used to any of that emergence work. It's not something that we give a lot of space for. So I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts too, and to open up the conversation as well.
Do we have some questions?
I have a question.
Yes. Would you give us your name, please?
My name is Lauren Fitzgerald, and I'm from Yeshiva University. Hi. So I confess, I already confessed this to Nicole. I started reading her book this morning on my way here from Washington Heights. And everything that I read so far resonated with me, but the language that I would use to talk about what you're talking about is ethos for presence. And even what you're talking about now, it's, the reverse order, not skills first. For me, that's what's the rhetorical purpose. So I'm interested, I know that you know that language, and I'm interested in what your rhetorical purpose was in not using those terms. I mean, maybe Sharon already commented on that you're writing to a broader audience.
I can just say that ethos is one of the components of presence.
Right.
But it wasn't capacious enough. And rhetorical occasion and rhetorical purpose, to me, again, limits the essay to the act of persuasion in a particular kind of way with particular publics at a particular moment. And it seems not to address entirely what I would just say is the aesthetic or craft elements of essay, the literary elements of the essay to the same extent. And so it felt too, I know it's not coded, and I know that we know what rhetoric is, but it felt a little too coded towards a particular kind of curriculum at a particular kind of time.
Yeah, I hear that, yeah.
Yes.
Tana, one of Nicole's former grad students and colleagues. So in the book you write about, I think it's responding to Robert Atwan about the essay, not even as a genre, but as a genre that moves across genres. And that really stuck with me because it seemed like a great puzzle. And it's really reflected how I experience it as a practitioner, but stumped me as a teacher. So I just would love if you have more thoughts, or if anyone up there has more thoughts about that. It keeps going around in my head after reading it.
Take that up.
So you're referring to the use of the essay in a variety of contexts and rhetorical situations?
Yeah, it's almost like a wind or like a spirit that sort of travels between genres. I mean, it is, I think it does have characteristics that qualify it as a genre, but I really loved the idea of it being a mobile genre, right? Like a movie, I think those library buses that drive around and bring books to people.
Or a porous genre.
Or porous, yeah. So I guess in terms of like, as a practitioner, that's not a problem. I can write lots of different kinds of essays, but as a teacher trying to choose things to teach to students, teaching them the kinds of essays that I want to choose to have them write, it's confusing. Like, okay, I want to teach them how to do something that they can apply over lots of different contexts, but I also want to have them learn about genre, learn to write specific kinds of essays, if that makes sense.
We always ask, but I mean, where does the essay exist outside of the classroom?
Yeah.
It does, obviously, in airports, right?
That should be an optimistic read where you can find
Sorry. No, obviously it exists out in the world. I just don't know if it exists in the world that my students engage in. On the other hand, they will engage in a variety of genres that perhaps are transactional that they need to kind of master in order to do well in particular situations. But yeah, I really like this moment in Burroughs' piece that I quoted from that, where essentially writing is an act of becoming. One cannot sit still, and I think that's very much the case with my students. They are unfinished, as we all are, and but the perhaps lack of confidence or the kind of self-knowledge who they are right now. I mean, I come back to the essay, but it's kind of the almost kind of the mutt genre version of it, or the messy version of the one that tends to be political, that is personal, that is provocative, that tends to break some lines and conventions. Are we still talking the essay? Or some hybrid version of it? So my students read Gloriane Zadul, a chapter from Borderland, Gloriane Zadul's piece. We're challenged to understand where do we put this chapter on how to tame a wild tongue. I mean, is it polemic? Is it a memoir? Is it an act of criticism? It's all those things. So if we're willing to sort of expand the notion of what an essay is, so be it. And I think it's obviously I would teach, and I do teach that piece as a kind of mirror for students to kind of look at themselves, to see something, ask who they are in this moment, as well as who they want to be down the road.
Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Carly Moore. I teach at NYU in the Global Liberal Studies program, and I have been Nicole's friend and graduate student, compatriot for so long. And I just want to say I'm so excited that this book is out in the world, and I've watched this book. We had a dissertation writing group, and I've just watched it transform from the dissertation to the book, and it's just extraordinary. So thank you, and thank you for not quitting. Because so many people need this book. I know I need it. So my question is, Leslie, I really liked your language about the fissure and the sort of eruption of the self. This is my language now that can really interrogate the self's kind of maybe messier or sort of more difficult parts. And I know that that's been true for me as a teacher of essays and also as a writer. And I feel like it's lurking underneath the surface in this conversation. Just what is this current political moment feels like the perfect time for the essay, especially for voices that are marginalized and not heard, and for students who feel that everything is a transaction. So I wonder if we could even just talk a little bit about like, what is it doing right now? Like I'm just thinking about Acosta being thrown out of the White House press room. So it's a big question, maybe.
One of the things that it creates the condition for the conversation that the writer wants to have. And I feel that's a form of agency that many people don't exercise or know is available to them, either in school or across disciplines or out of school. And so in terms of the portability, Tana, of essay, one of the things that students may not know, Howard, that they might have access to essays or they might engage with it, but if they're engaging in social media that contains words, caveat, and images, once in a while, maybe by mistake, they will click on something and it will lead them to a blog post, an op-ed. They will happen upon what is an essay. And I think the thing that I most want to have happen is for that to be a familiar experience rather than a rarefied one, and one that's part of life that pervades our lives, to just acknowledge that. We don't have to make that happen. We're in it already, but what do we do with those opportunities? And so it also, Carly, to your point, and I think your own work in essay is such great testimony to this, that it's hard to be brave about bringing together the things that we are engaging with and reading or valuing as like the materials of the world next to our deepest political, moral concerns that we have as people walking through the world. It seems to be no home for that. You can't text that. You can't do it. So, but it needs a home, and it needs a home for years and years and years and years. So that's what I'm kind of hoping we can engage with through this practice. Please do.
Yeah, I love that. I found that what you just said really moving, and I was thinking about that a lot. The timing, the way that the timing on Best American goes is that you end up writing, you assemble the pieces and write the introduction near the end of the year before. So I was writing the introduction to Best American 2017 in November and December of 2016, which is part of why the introduction is really essentially this question of like how and why is the essay political, and in a sense that I don't mention Trump in the introduction, I think, it was very much about like why do essays matter? How is the essay and its practices of sort of self-interrogation and destabilization, and why does it feel like an important political way of thinking? I was also noticing that my students at that time almost felt a pressure, like everything that they were putting out for a workshop felt like it essentially had to be like a political op-ed or something, and it was like there was like a marked decline in the quality of the writing too. I wanted to say, like, you don't all need to become political op-ed writers, and actually the world doesn't necessarily want you all to be political op-ed writers, and like there other kinds of writing matter not less but more, or not despite their lack of topicality, but maybe because of it. And to me, I think it really does have to do with this like destabilizing of knowledge rather than sort of assumption and like intractability or something, which is not to say like I feel like fact-checking matters now more than ever, but like in a way, not to totally derail us, but it's like there are many ways to indict Kavanaugh, but to me one of them is like that he's like the anti-essayist. Like he assumes his whole premise is that he knows himself fully. He knows, even if you want to grant him the benefit of the doubt, that he sort of knows his own history or his past or his actions fully and can speak from that place of certainty, which is like the opposite of what the premise of the essay is, which is to say, like, I don't know myself and I don't know truth. And so I think there's something politically useful about that stance of questioning.
And since you brought up Jim Acosta, who as far as I know is not an essayist but a reporter, I just want to say that I feel like these times point also to the importance of simply trying one's best to say what we see and what is happening, and not always with all the art and self-interrogation of an essay. I mean, what I see is always what I see from where I am, but the effort to do that in a way that actually isn't imbued with my presence, but is just a statement that I think for so long we've been so suspicious of. I now have come to really see the value of just saying this is what is happening. And we see that that's a very vexed endeavor, and it's very hard for people to agree about what is happening. And but it's important, and that essays are important, but I think that reportage is also important. And I think in celebrating the value of the essay, I personally don't want to go down a road that says that things that aspire to a more factual, objective tone are therefore not valuable. Which was not what you were saying at all.
Because I'm totally for clear reportage. I think it just gets at this tension too, though, which is the binary that Nicole also writes about, and she and I talk about a lot, like the academic and the creative, or the factual and the artful, and I'm excited about this book because it just really pushes through that, and it also pushes through the language of the personal to say that it's not actually just the personal. It's something called presence, which is far more complex.
Sharon, I also want to say I totally value the thing you just said about taking note. But people don't know why they should note things or how to note things very often. We don't have practices of just gathering materials. And so one of the interventions I'm trying to think about is the difference between let me write a piece in which I will find evidence for a pre-baked idea that I already had in mind versus let me make sense of these disparate materials that are very upsetting or that are true, and I have whatever feelings I have about them. Let me first state that they are materials, that we can look at them together, and now it is my responsibility, if I choose to take it, to make something of them. But these are, for me, that's a skill I want. I want the gathering skill.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Alessia. I'm a doctoral candidate, so also writing in the sort of nebulous genre that is the dissertation.
That's the easy one.
Yeah, sure. That's what I would call it. So I was also very lucky to have Nicole as my sort of pedagogy guru in teaching writing, so I'm teaching university writing, and it's completely changed my perspective. So beyond the book and a lot of what you were saying, the word that sort of came to mind a lot was humility. Humility and vulnerability, which are two things that I think are almost antithetical to the academic settings that we often occupy. And it was, in my 5th year during the fellowship that I was taking the pedagogy course, and I realized, I have no idea what writing is about, and now I do. And it was this sort of sense of liberation that you brought. Because there is a presence that matters, right? That actually led me to do a lot more writing and has drastically changed the way I feel about writing a dissertation. And when I bring these concepts and this kind of ethos to others that are in the same boat, it's a little revolutionary almost, right? And it shouldn't be. I feel like a lot of us come here with professors assuming that, you're here, you know how to write, you know exactly what to do, you know how to make an argument, you know how to use evidence, do it. And yeah, I mean, sure, but there are all these key elements, and there's learning and relearning the art of writing. And so what I was wondering is why isn't there some kind of version of a university writing, or a kind of an a teaching of the ethos of the essay that you're bringing to the conversation on a larger level, and can there be, again, how can we bring your book to everyone across disciplines rather than just within writing studies?
I think you have to ask the fundamental question to all faculty members who are willing to have the conversation. What do you ask your students to write, and why do you ask them to write? From there, you can begin to then say, and what would you like it to be? Well, often what you start to hear, and others can speak to this as well, I'm sure, is that many of us kind of just do assign the writing, and we know what the content is that we need it to have, but we may miss the relationship between the kind of thinkers we wish our students were and the kind of writing we are or are not inviting them to be.
Yeah, that's pedagogy. I mean, you're talking about teaching. We're talking about being self-aware as teachers as to our intended outcomes and where we're starting and how we want to sequence assignments. What do we want each assignment to produce in students? It's about giving attention in graduate programs to the art of teaching the essay, but teaching reading as well, as I mentioned before, rather than assume that because you've made it to this point that you know exactly what to do in day one when you go to the classroom. I'm a little discouraged because that's exactly where it was when I entered the classroom at UCLA, and wow, is it still the case? People aren't talking about teaching in English departments. I know that I hear that there is some preparation going on in teaching of writing, and certain writing programs, obviously, and preparing graduate TAs in rhetoric and comp, and what it means to write in various disciplines. But English written broadly, it sounds to me as if we still don't understand that we have to spend time talking about these things and build them into the graduate curriculum.
Hi, I'm Aaron Ritzenberg. I teach in the English department in the writing program here. First of all, thank you everyone. This is such a great panel. It's really exciting to me. I want to invite people to think about Nicole's title, Crafting Presence. We've talked mostly about presence, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about crafting, because it seems like it's distinct from what some people might think about the essay, which is about discovering presence rather than crafting presence. And I wonder if you can talk about the tension between the suggestion that when you craft presence, there may not be a deep, true self, versus this idea that we want authentic curiosity and authentic engagement, which suggests that there is actually authenticity there.
I feel like this one's for you, Lee.
Well, yeah, I mean, just thinking about that on like a few different levels, and I mean, one thing I appreciate about those two words together, crafting presence, is how it intersects, maybe probably intentionally, with the way that the conversation around presence tends to happen in the world of creative nonfiction, or just kind of popular reception of personal narrative, which is understood, and this gets back to a distinction you made early on, Nicole, between exposure and presence, right? Where so often personal narrative is understood in terms of exposure. The writer kind of parts the curtain to show like the naked body, especially if it's like a female writer doing personal writing, right? And so I think like crafting presence understands implicitly already or explicitly that like the even when presence and the personal intersect, and I love the ways people have been talking about, I love the way the book talks about the fact that they're different, you know, and that feels so important. But even when personal narrative and presence intersect, the personal isn't being disclosed or revealed or exposed, it's being crafted, and that feels like this conversation that keeps needing to happen, I think, where like the writer, even in a personal narrative, is being created as a character on the page. And sometimes I feel, I mean, especially in like scholarly or academic settings, you know, I can feel a bit like a bit obtuse or a bit old school, or like I'm here talking about like the person or the author and, you know, not destabilizing it all. And, you know, so I have a ton of insecurities around even like maybe wanting to affirm certain kinds of authenticity, but understanding there are all sorts of rigorous, useful conversations that mean to undermine or destabilize that sense of authenticity. But I do think that what I feel very deeply about the essay is that any kind of presence, whether it's happening through personal narrative or simply the kind of emergence of a sensibility, construction of a sensibility across the pages, is very much made. And so like in a way that's not separate from what we do when we like live our days, right? Like we're not just like a self that moves through the world and manifests that single self all over the place. Like we're constantly in this act of like creating, and we create ourselves slightly differently inside of every interaction we're in, and in every context we're in. I create myself differently in this room than I do across campus when I teach to my students. So I think to get to your question, like I think the crafting part of the title is doing all kinds of work, both to sort of remind us always of the ways that like the personal narrator is always made, not shown, and also this way that like it's actually not just a truth of the essay, but sort of a being, that like ourselves are multiple and they're not static entities that we expose. They're like always being made and formed and remade and reformed.
Yeah, this reminds me of discussions we've had in my college and in the department and also in my division about Title IX. Many, in fact, they've been up in arms because according to Title IX, we as faculty are reporters of any particular narratives having to do with trauma, sexual assault. And suddenly, we haven't really sort of unpacked what are we getting in student writing that provides a kind of revelation. Is it so-called, is it discovered or authentic, or is it made and created? So, I mean, it's so interesting to think about the kind of implications for us as reporting colleagues on this sort of really important piece of legislation. It becomes a public matter, a public issue. It's no longer merely academic. What is that self that's being presented in the writing? Are we to read it naively as simply autobiography, or are we to read it as a thing crafted, made? I don't think legislators are really into that stuff, but we are being mindful of the distinction. I see this come up in this case, as in terms of the grounds that you set up in this book, Nicole.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Alfie Guy. You might be tired of Aaron's question already, but I want to pitch it at Sharon and Howard, because I've heard you both say something that I think is relevant to this. And if Howard, when you said something about writing and essays maybe being an opportunity for becoming, and of course your students are becoming, so maybe there's a place for them. And Sharon, really, I think a straightforward but true thing that you said out of Nicole's book, which is the essay as the perfect genre for liberal arts education. And to me, both of those get to this idea, Aaron, I think is underneath your question, that you craft presence in an essay, and in that sense it's a little bit of an artifact, but through the practice of becoming an essay crafter, you craft presence in yourself. Like you exercise the habit of being present, therefore you're becoming, and therefore you're sort of getting towards the aim of a liberal arts education. All of which, by the way, I totally believe in, even though I went to graduate school in the 80s, and I know all the reasons why it's not true. So I don't know if either of you want to talk about it either from the thing I pointed to that you said or from any other reason, but I'm still interested in your question.
The first thing I would say would pick up on what Leslie's been saying is by putting together presence and crafting, I think, Nicole, you avoid some of the charges made against the term presence, that it assumes there's a self that's coherent and stable and that exists before language, before writing, before representation, and the only job of writing is to accurately transcribe that as though we know what it is. And, you can call that the metaphysical sense of presence, but all of the quibbles with the term presence are with the idea of that there being something fixed, stable, that exists outside, not just language, but reflection, and drives language and reflection. And so by saying that presence is crafted, you're making clear that you see presence as something that emerges only in the act of not just language as some static tool, skills again, but grappling with the effort of trying to take feelings and ideas and put them into sentences and paragraphs. I think in terms of the liberal arts education, like the distinction of the liberal arts education as opposed to graduate education or community college education is that you are becoming a self through not just the acquisition of knowledge and skills, but through the encounter with texts, with other people encountering those texts. And so learning how to craft words would also be part of the project of figuring out who you are and crafting who you are. I don't really want to become the skills advocate, but craft without skill is right. So I think that when I think about teaching writing, I think all the questions you're posing are really important for helping me understand why I'm bothering and why I'm asking my students to bother and how to get them to connect to what they're doing. But I also think that there can be something really soothing, relaxing, and sort of de-dramatizing and therefore helpful in telling them, just practice like rewriting some passive voice sentences as active voice. And just do, I can tell you why it's important, but just practice that. And then maybe they internalize that skill when they come to write, and so when they're coming to write, they can engage these really higher order questions because they've internalized and grasped these in some ways lower order skills, but necessary, and skills that if they're not internalized will compromise the writing for them.
That's 100% true. I just want to speak back to this, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. The thing that I called the chapter, I think it's 5, error and illumination when you craft a reading presence. And one of the things that I want to keep thinking about is how, when I think about essay as the potential heart of a liberal education, it's about being wrong a lot of the time. Your sentences are going to be bad and wrong. Your ideas are going to be bad and wrong. I don't mean like 'cause you're a bad person. Well, you might be. But and maybe that changes when you read some more stuff, But that it's iterative, and that the purpose is I want to write myself to the point of needing a better sentence than the one that I have here, and I want to become a good enough reader, skilled enough reader, for example, of the genre of essay, to know that varying my sentence lengths are going to do something both to communicate my idea, work with my pieces that I am making into evidence, or I have earned the right to call evidence, in a way that will give me a reason, a located reason to work on those lower order skills. It's not, it's just iterative. So I'm glad to have both. Sorry, Julie.
Well, you actually just answered my question, which is that part of, I haven't read the book yet, which I will, but that part of crafting is, for me, is thinking against expression. And when you started thinking about, when you started talking about the iterative, that got me really thinking about it, because I was thinking about Church of Craft. I don't know if any of you know about Church of Craft. The Church of Craft is a movement to sort of give the quality that religious life gives to people who are what is otherwise called secular. So the idea of Church of Craft is that it's collective organizing principle where people make things, right? It's a making space under the aegis of a collaborative or collective, right? So Church of Craft is you go there to knit, or you write, or you go there to make a figure out of something. And so I guess my question is, like, it's about the minor villain of skills, right? I think about this a lot with teaching writing to students who are never going to be writers, right? They self-conceptualize themselves that way. I'm never going to be a writer, right? And I think, it's against skills. Like, how do you teach, and you sort of started talking about it when you talked about the iterative. How can you make your sentence slightly better? What do you get when you add a clause in the middle of the sentence? But for students who that isn't their predilection, right? Or they're even anti-disposed to it. What ideas do you have yourself, as somebody who's done this for so long, of sort of introducing students or trying to get students to think about the craft as a practice, not as an expression, not as end-oriented, and not as actually really about the self, and instead about sort of, the way they might think about learning how to use a lathe.
Well, this is a time where, had the universe worked differently, and we had all been disciplinarily in conversation about this, 40 years ago, we would have some of those answers. For example, we would have the terms from the cognitive approach to composition from Linda Flower on the relationship between reader-based prose and writer-based prose, to help students understand that I may not want to be an artiste on the page, but I can be sensitized to look at sentences, for example, that I can tell are coded for my own brain, versus those that I am writing in order to help some reader who is not me understand what I'm talking about. But we didn't have those conversations, and that's why it can feel like when a student says, I am not a writer, I will not be a writer, I just feel like saying, what are you doing right now? What are you doing right now? So, as my grandmother would say, tough, tough. You are a writer right now. You may decide that you're not self-identifying, you're not going to invest, I'm reading this wonderful series of science fiction books that Jenny Davidson recommended, the Craft series. And in it, you make transactions through little pieces of soul, okay? And I'm thinking, you're doing a transaction through a little piece of soul. You can decide whether or not you're going to invest it with a lot of extra stuff, but that's what's there. Your life, as I say frequently, so forgive me, everybody, but this is our real life going by. And so, are you doing something meaningful right now with it? That sounds very woo. Sorry, my sister is here. Okay, blue stuff. But anyway, but really, truly, then make it a sentence just so that no one is going to misunderstand what you're trying to say. And if you're trying to not say anything, I want you to cop to that too.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yes.
So beautiful, thank you. Thank you for the questions. There's this, in Untitled unpublished dissertation, which came out 2 years ago, or pieces of it, she talks about her writing process, and one of the things she says, and it just reminds me of what you said about science fiction, is there's like these pieces of her soul that because the world is so painful with white supremacy and heteropatriarchy that get like split off and have to go and be safe. And the writing process helps her integrate those pieces. And I'm a writing teacher trained in ethnic studies, but previously trained as a therapist, and so these intersections of what it means, like there is, however we want to use the word trauma, it's a complicated word, but there is something about, especially for students who, when they look at what's on the page, doesn't reflect back them or their histories or their survival. In these institutions, they have to come and write. So I'm wondering about sort of how we think about the university, the power structures in the university at the intersection of these histories of survival and also trauma in the writing process. Small question, but.
Howard, what do you think?
I think context matters. I think where we are, where our classrooms are situated matters. I think our students vary so widely across various sectors of higher ed. I think agency matters for a lot of my students. The confidence that they can make something, going back to this notion of craft. something maybe not at the sentence level style, but yeah, I'm involved with a study about writing transfer across institutions, and it's become crystal clear to many of us that the ability of students to transfer what they know about writing from one context to another is very much dependent on what they are bringing in terms of their own developmental stages, their own age and level of maturity, their histories that they bring with into the classroom, and the institutional rewards that they might be getting and aspirations that they have at being in the institution. So access matters, open access matters, and determines obviously the demographics of our classroom. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear, I think, from folks outside of Comp Red, and maybe to kind of clue into what you were saying, what your goal, grand goal is, Nicole, which is to bring the letters and Comp Red together again, kind of have a conversation going on about what it means to write an essay. I would very much like to introduce my students to these remarkable writers. And if I can find a way to do it pedagogically, I'll do it. Because I think, as opposed to the way I used to teach professional essays, now I think there's a way for students to see pieces of themselves in a Burroughs piece. There's a way to see the kind of work that my students do in many of these writers. In other words, essays do not necessarily have to exude privilege, but rather varied experience that can perhaps speak to my students as well as to students at other levels of higher ed. So again, I just think that we have to be cognizant of who those students are in the classrooms and adjust our pedagogy.
I'd also like to say that in your book, Nicole, I thought you developed such a rich idea of presence, but applying it just to the liberal arts context seemed to me to be a limitation. That when I think of graduate students and graduate student writing and how much it would benefit from thinking more about how to craft presence, why are so many, I mean, I'm not saying that dissertations are essays, but why are so many dissertations so deadly doomed? It's because people haven't allowed themselves to develop presence in their work and to think about where they're going and division and so forth. And it would just be so good for graduate education if some of these skills were actually admitted into that kind of genre of writing that we call the dissertation process. And I don't quite know how to do that institutionally because we're so heavily siloed. But I think about that when I have all these graduate students trying to write the first and second chapters. And where is that presence that makes it animated and feel like there's a motive for writing this thing rather than just to get the degree?
Sharon, will you talk about the role of graduate student writers in public books?
Well, so Public Books is an online magazine, you can see it at publicbooks.org, that is designed to give people with scholarly knowledge a way to reach a broader public. So most of the writing is about recently published books. And when we reach out to people, ask them to write for us, many of them haven't done this kind of writing before. So, but that's not true only of the graduate students. In fact, these days often the graduate students have done many kinds of writing, and it's more advanced professors of literature or history or economics who haven't done a broader kind of writing. But what I always say to people is we're not looking for summary and evaluation. We want something that has an idea that only you would have reading these books. You're bringing the idea to the books. You're not just telling us what ideas are in the books, which I think is related to the idea of presence. Like, what do you see that nobody else would because of what you know? So I think we focus on telling people to think about what they know and how what they know gives them a particular vantage point in this encounter with a book or books. But I wouldn't say, I think that graduate students feel a certain freedom in writing for public books that they don't feel when writing their dissertations. So I think that many would find it surprising to hear professors say, we want you to have more of a presence in your dissertation. I think there's an idea that scholarly writing should be totally impersonal, objective, mostly about anticipating and warding off withering criticism. So that's the main goal in that, and you describe that kind of writer, someone who's just sort of marshaling all the facts to make sure that they are invulnerable, not necessarily personally, but as someone making a claim. And I think in thinking, what happens with public books is there's a different audience, and so in imagining a different reader, not the censorious faculty advisors, the junta of three who will sit and say, what about this and what about that, which we usually don't do, but is what I find a lot of graduate students really want to imagine us doing. The audience for public books is less, it's not disciplinary, it's large enough that you can't really know who it is, and so sometimes not knowing who your reader is can be very liberating.
Thank you for saying that part, because in the vision of like what would every graduate student and faculty member do in my version of the universe, it would be to write for public books.
Do we have one last question? Yes.
Okay, so I'm Shelby Wardlaw, and I teach in UW and also work in the Writing Center. And I really enjoyed what Sharon Marcus you had to say about the Writing Center having this energy of injury and repair. And I'm never going to get that out of my head because it's so true that that's what it's like. And as we've been talking about this, we're kind of discussing the essay as sort of like a bruised genre, right? Like it's this thing that you have to
Put
go
some
in.
arnica on it.
Yeah, tell us what the pedagogical equivalent of arnica is that I can give my students. But so my question is kind of a pedagogical question then. If it seems like we're all pretty comfortable talking about this being a genre of injury and repair, but we're also talking about it as a form of public thinking. So it's really hard to be injured and repaired publicly, right? And I find that that's a lot of what my students at the Writing Center and in my classes are really afraid of, right? It's vulnerable. And I try to kind of make that palatable to them, but I think as writers and as educators, we're a little bit more comfortable with that. And from a pedagogical perspective, I was wondering if anyone has ideas for how to encourage students to enter into this injurious and repairing genre, and kind of acknowledging that it's not like something that they're going to win or they're going to necessarily like triumph at, but still they should do. It's a really difficult concept.
I don't have an immediate answer to that, which seems to me reasonable and a good thing, but what the response that immediately bubbles up for me is, so sometimes we tell people, just write what you want and silence your inner critic and your outer critics, and don't, write for this non-supportive reader that many people are quick to imagine. And even, I think I've certainly read a lot of writers talking about their own process, not always, but often they're male, saying, I just write what I want and damn everybody else, and my job is to like not care about what anyone else thinks, just follow my vision. And some of the, for many of them it's extremely enabling, and they produce great writing out of that, and they're very sensitive sometimes too. I mean, when reading like James Kurtz's autobiographical fiction, that's the stance he seeks to cultivate and assume. And then we tell people, write so that you're really thinking about the reader. So I don't know, I mean, maybe the thing is to think of the reader as someone who isn't going to injure you, but in fact, there are a lot of injurious readers out there, and these days, I think people are very aware with anything they put out in public about all the kinds of verbal and literal violence that it might elicit. So it's tricky. And it's tricky for teachers, because our job is both to say, this is what I think you could do better, which there's always going to be a slight element of injury to that, and here's how I can support you and help you do that, which is the repair and the holding. There's therapy and there's pedagogy, and they're not that different, but they can feel really different.
I wonder if the repair could happen from a kind of decentering. In other words, I really like Wolf's notion of radical empathy, which is sort of trying to kind of get out of their own head and see and animate or be part of what the author's trying to do, maybe a little old-fashioned imitation, exploration, see what's possible. I hate to think of it as a job is to prepare them, but to really kind of get it's a widen the horizon for our students.
Shelley, I think that the thing for me is, I just don't want to lie to people about the fact that that will happen. That something's going to get messed up. Something will crack. It doesn't have to be your deepest, darkest, but it might be. Because it's a human project, it's a human practice. So if you write hard into a text that you think is the safest text in the world, you may find yourself on territory that you actually can't go to in a public sense. And so as the teacher, we have to say, what are the many roads one has into a text that could get you to say things that you may or may not be prepared to have public. That's the first part. And the second part is, what is the role of community in the room in terms of not taking care of the writer per se, because we don't know each other well enough, even in 14 weeks, to earn that most times, right? But to say, I can learn how to ask a good question of what you're doing. I can describe my experience as your reader and the places where I'm getting into difficulties, or where I wonder if you're getting into difficulties, or where I actually need more from the texts that you're working with, because they could help you maybe get out of your difficulties. So there's a way in which we have to be frank about that possibility, and not try and solve it all in a one semester course. The way to not get people in trouble or potentially traumatize ourselves over and over again in the context of a writing course is not have it be the only one time in your university experience where you have to do that. So.